Throughout this course, our group has endured heightened levels of stress in order to convey as much information about anxiety to the class as possible. We began by trying to form an acceptable definition of anxiety, and in doing so, distinguished it from other similar terms. Anxiety falls under a similar umbrella to other emotions such as fear, stress, and panic, but is ultimately more complex and requires a slightly more nuanced approach. Anxiety is a secondary emotion that can be described as the fearful reaction to another emotion. Anxiety is a particularly interesting and often problematic emotion because the stressor causing it isn't always identified and can vary based on the individual, the species, and the environment. It's easy to accept that other animal species feel things like fear and pain, but complex emotions like anxiety are often misattributed as a distinctly human trait. When you think of anxiety, you might think of an intricate human ability to fear and worry about abstract things. However, countless studies have suggested that anxiety-like behavior is present in a variety of species. It can exist in very simplistic actions and behaviors, such as impulses causing an organism to move towards, away, or against something, defense and attack mechanisms, protection, or attention orientation and inhibition. Protozoans, unicellular eukaryotic organisms, show avoidance of danger and even flight, representing a rudimentary form of anxiety or fear of the future. Because of the evolutionary benefits it has incurred, anxiety has been conserved across the phylum, even in tiny worms without central nervous systems. Unfortunately, this presentation won't be on cool, sexy protozoans and tiny worms, but instead on boring humans. However, it's important to remember that we have this evolutionary lineage with lower-level species when approaching a topic like anxiety. Anxiety and anxiety disorders are often a very personal and disruptive aspect of our lives. As a result, it's easy to think about them as abstract and subjective. However, what we hope to show is that anxiety has as much evolutionary basis as hair color or the shape of our thumbs. Ultimately, what makes anxiety often seem like such a loaded and maladaptive emotion are the particular environments us humans live in. The relationship between environment and anxiety is understudied and complicated, but it's one of the only ways to truly construct a systematic analysis of the evolutionary origins and functions of anxiety. In Fear and Fitness, an evolutionary analysis of anxiety disorders, Marks and Ness propose a model of anxiety disorders that centers on combating hypophobia, or the absence of anxiety. It's understandable that too much anxiety is a bad thing, but too little anxiety is also problematic. If a drug were discovered that abolished all anxiety, it would do more harm than good, as the individual taking it would feel no reservations in flooring their car, going near dangerous animals, or ostracizing themselves from others. Adaptive moderation is the key to survival. However, this moderation takes different forms in different environments. For instance, the authors speculate that generalized anxiety likely emerged from an environment whose threats couldn't be defined clearly. Conversely, more specific anxiety subtypes were likely adaptive in more niche environments to give adaptive protection from a particular kind of danger. They then argue that the reason anxiety disorders, both generalized and other, seem so disruptive in our current industrial lifestyle is because our environments have evolved much faster than our neural hardware is capable of. Studies have shown that humans demonstrate much higher levels of stress, fear, and anxiety towards stimuli like snakes, spiders, and sharks than they do towards stimuli like cars, guns, or cigarettes. All of these things pose a threat to humans, certainly, but the latter ones are statistically much more dangerous. Not having been present long enough to materially alter a genetic endowment, modern perils are feared too little, while more primitive ones are feared too much. As sophisticated as the human intellect is, it still can't easily override genetic predispositions. Accepting that our environment can have more control over us than natural selection does is difficult, but it's also integral for developing a comprehensive Darwinian model of psychopathology. This type of model helps explain why we feel these often negative emotions so deeply, which can help us come closer to developing more effective treatments for anxiety disorders. Panic disorder, for example, is something that can be very debilitating for people today. However, the evolutionary model proposed by Mark and Ness argues that panic's relationship to anxiety is tantamount to vomiting's relationship to nausea. Mild threat causes a general increase in anxiety that helps to locate the source and type of danger and to plan possible ways to deal with it. General anxiety usually precedes panic, which is often an extreme response to extreme or sudden danger. Likewise, nausea stops one from eating, useful if the food being ingested is toxic, and leads one to avoid the foods that induce nausea, also useful. Extreme nausea culminates in vomiting, which expels the contents of the stomach. Throughout the article, the authors stress that viewpoints similar to this are how we should proceed in analyzing anxiety disorders, as anxiety is as much an adaptive defense against harmful stimuli as is the immune system. Consider other subtypes of anxiety. Social anxiety, for instance, likely emerged from environments where group cooperation was highly important. A hunter-gatherer who isolated him or herself from the rest of the community was more likely to get attacked by an animal or run out of food. Therefore, it became adaptive to experience constant preoccupation over one's social standing. Obsessive-compulsive disorder may have developed and persisted in environments susceptible to contagion. Typical obsessions and compulsions seem exaggerated in today's society, but may have incurred an adaptive advantage in environments where the desire to be clean was significant, and the process of becoming clean wasn't as easy as just washing one's hands with soap. Hoarding, which just recently became recognized as its own disorder and not just a constellation of OCD symptoms, is characterized by excessive acquisition of items and an unwillingness to part with said items. In environments with fewer accessible resources, hoarding could have emerged as a way to combat resource scarcity and guard against future shortages. In summary, the features of generalized anxiety disorder and anxiety subtypes largely correspond to various dangers humans have faced during their evolution. These have evolved to combat cases of hypophobia, which is extremely understudied, as people with too little anxiety rarely come to psychiatrists complaining of deficient fear. The law of diminishing returns applies to anxiety as to so much else. A little anxiety may yield protective gains, but too much fear may not be worth the costs. The beauty is in the balance, and the modern human's fast-paced lifestyle and rapidly changing environment makes this balance hard to strike. Humans are the most versatile species on the planet in terms of our environment. We can thrive in barren deserts, isolated islands, and highly industrialized cities, but we still all, in general, have uniform psycho and neurophysiology. The next few articles show in which ways anxiety disorders exist within and respond to different human environments. In one study published in 2014, Salas, Wright, Kagotho, and Vaughn set out to answer the following. 1. Whether immigrant status in the United States is protective for mood, anxiety, and personality disorders. 2. Whether the effect of immigrant status holds across generations and among both racial and ethnic minority and non-minority populations in the United States. And 3, what is the prevalence of mood, anxiety, and personality disorders of immigrants from major regions across the world? Data were collected by interviewers who administered the Alcohol Use Disorder and Associated Disabilities Interview Schedule DSM-IV version, which helps diagnose mood, anxiety, personality, and substance use disorders. Participants were grouped into first-generation immigrants, second-generation immigrants, and native-born Americans. Immigrants were significantly less likely to meet the criteria for the diagnosis of mood, anxiety, and personality disorders, controlling for socio-demographic factors. First-generation immigrants were less likely to meet criteria for most mood disorders, all anxiety disorders, and the majority of personality disorders. Similarly, second-generation immigrants were significantly less likely to meet the criteria for one or more mood or anxiety disorders as compared to native-born Americans. Unlike first-generation immigrants, there was no significant association between generalized anxiety disorder, dysthymia, or social phobia among second-generation immigrants as compared to native-born Americans. Racial and ethnic minority, as well as non-minority immigrants, were significantly less likely to meet criteria for mood and anxiety disorders, but these effects were significantly greater for racial and ethnic minority immigrants. Immigrant status and mood and anxiety disorders were significantly associated for second-generation racial and ethnic minority immigrants, but there was no significant relationship among second-generation non-minority immigrants. Compared to immigrants from various regions around the world, the prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders as well as personality disorders among native-born Americans is greater. Immigrants from Europe had the highest prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders, followed by immigrants from Latin America and immigrants from Asia. African immigrants had the lowest prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders. The fact that there was a lower prevalence of mood, anxiety, and personality disorders among first-generation immigrants questions previous evidence, which has linked lower income and education levels with psychiatric morbidity among individuals, which first-generation immigrants are more likely to report. It is interesting to note that, as previous studies have found, there might be a link between exposure to industrialized Western society and mental illness. Post-migration factors play a role in the development of mental illness. In addition to stressful factors that may lead to immigration, immigrants experience numerous adjustment stressors when coming to the U.S., such as loss of lifelong relationships, altered family roles, and economic difficulties. All of these stressors have adverse effects on mental health. Racism and discrimination may also play a role in the mental health of immigrants. Disruption of family and support networks could also play a role in the mental health of immigrants, especially those who come from collectivist cultures. Taken together, these results suggest that immigrant status in the United States seems to be protective against the development of mood and anxiety disorders. However, differences in reporting or diagnostic criteria may prove confounds to these results. Many investigations have also compared the prevalence of and attitudes towards anxiety in families from different countries. The nuances of how parental attitudes towards things like anxiety, fear, and sick behaviors affect children in different ways. Studies aim to reveal potential cultural norms about the way societies view anxiety, as well as the ways in which children are affected by their surrounding environment and parental relationships as they grow up. It has been shown that anxiety disorders tend to run in families, and that rates of anxiety within families are significantly higher when compared to rates within the population at large. This suggests that anxiety may be transmitted within the family in some way, contributing to an evolutionary understanding of why an adult with anxiety might have a child with a similar level of anxiety. If the adult is thriving with a certain level of anxiety, it is feasible that the adult experiencing anxiety in their environment should have a child with similar anxiety levels to maximize survival and safety. Although the mechanism behind this transmission is not yet fully understood, it is suggested that the area of transmission is through learning experiences. A study conducted in 2010 compared the frequency and transmission of anxiety among adolescents between 12 and 17 years old in both Japan and England, using questionnaires, hoping to pinpoint cultural differences in both the prevalence of and attitude towards anxiety. They compared gender, age, and learning experience. Interestingly, findings from Western cultures haven't always been replicated in Eastern cultures. Surprising results showed that England had much higher levels of anxiety levels than Japan, and there were no significant differences in early learning experience, parent punishment, or reinforcement of anxiety. For non-anxiety physical symptoms, such as sick behavior, England was higher in parent punishment, and Japan was higher in parent reinforcement. Interestingly, the parent verbal transmission about the danger of anxiety and cold symptoms was more common in Japan than in England. In both places, less punishment led to higher anxiety. Further, the nuances of the results were telling. England had significantly higher levels of social phobia, panic, and generalized anxiety than Japan, and girls in both countries had higher levels of social phobia, separation anxiety, physical injury fear, and generalized anxiety. These results are indicative of societal biases. Higher anxiety in girls reveals that girls might be socialized to be more fearful and are reinforced when reporting inner worries and fears. Since results were similar in England and Japan, this socialization must exist in both countries. Furthermore, in both countries, parental reinforcement of sick behavior was higher for girls as well. Some might argue for biological or physiological mediations, but these haven't yet been concretely demonstrated, and societal forces must also be at play. Correlation direction also defied expectation. Parental punishment of anxiety decreased anxiety behavior, and there was a positive correlation of anxiety behavior with parental reinforcement of sick behavior. Finally, parent punishments for showing anxiety symptoms were associated with fewer anxiety-related symptoms among adolescents in both countries. There were some different results for each country, however. For example, there was a distinct pattern for learning experience of non-anxiety physical symptoms in Japan. Punishment for non-anxiety symptoms was associated with fewer symptoms, showing a communication of the danger of non-anxiety symptoms. This was not found in the English sample. Furthermore, an overall encouragement of cold-related symptoms was higher in Japan than in England, demonstrating that parents in Japan tend to reinforce non-anxiety physical symptoms more than anxiety symptoms. The conclusions from this study reflect important differences in both attitudes surrounding anxiety and ontogeny of anxiety, further supporting the notion that environmental factors alter prevalence and presentation of anxiety disorders. Finally, in a review of the current literature on cross-cultural examinations of anxiety disorders, Marquet et al. In 2011 found that etiology and presentation of anxiety disorders depend on both universal, species-specific predispositions as well as culture-specific learning. Among the literature, there seems to be significant variation in the prevalence of anxiety disorders both cross-nationally as well as within the United States. Specifically, rates of generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and social anxiety disorder appear lower in non-Western populations, including Mexico, China, South Korea, Japan, and Nigeria, as compared to Western populations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, and Australia. Also, the prevalence of specific phobia is lower in Asian and Latin American countries, as well as in Asian and Latino American populations within the U.S. Rates of specific phobia in African Americans appears to be significantly greater than rates of specific phobia in African countries. As might be expected, rates of post-traumatic stress disorder were consistently higher in trauma-exposed nations. In Western industrialized nations, the prevalence of PTSD remained lower, 1.1% in the US and 3.9% in European nations. Among trauma-exposed samples in African countries, however, rates of PTSD ranged from 35% to 99%. Among trauma-exposed immigrants and refugees in industrialized settings, such as the United States, rates of PTSD ranged from 50% to 85%. Important to note, however, is that the validity of PTSD diagnoses are controversial because ideologies of trauma and psychological distress vary across cultures. Different results derived from using different diagnostic measures of anxiety disorders indicate that westernized measures in the DSM may not accurately translate to the diagnosis of anxiety disorders in other cultures and ethnic groups. The authors suggest that there also might be differences in risk factors among different nations and ethnic groups that affect the development and maintenance of anxiety disorders. Different types of trauma and other environmental stressors also make it difficult to analyze the extreme variation in rates of PTSD across cultures. It's interesting that rates of PTSD, unlike other anxiety disorders, are not exclusively observed in high amounts in the context of industrialized Western countries, but seem to be especially prevalent, potentially, in transitioning hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Kalahari Bushmen, as well as in other societies that experience mass trauma. In terms of presentation of anxiety disorders, pathological worry and apprehension, symptomatic of generalized anxiety disorder, are observed consistently across cultures, with some variation in specific topics of worry. In regards to panic disorder, individuals from non-Western countries seem to have more somatic symptoms as opposed to psychological symptoms that are more prevalent in individuals from Western countries. Again, as the authors note, this may be due to cultural differences in perception of psychological symptoms as being weak or socially disrupting. Specific cultural differences in types of fears include specific domains of worry and generalized anxiety disorder, allocentric versus egocentric focus in social anxiety disorder, fear of animals versus fear of blood in specific phobias, and palpitations versus dizziness in panic disorder. Important possible confounds to acknowledge in these studies include differences in reporting anxiety disorders and inability of DSM diagnostic criteria to remain relevant cross-culturally. Ultimately, based on the recent literature surrounding cross-cultural variation in anxiety disorders, the authors argue that there are both universal anxiety disorders that can be categorized and diagnosed cross-culturally. However, they also conclude that culture shapes the specific qualities of anxiety-related symptoms. Specifically, much cultural variation exists in the focus of anxious fears and phobias, specific symptomatology, and catastrophic cognitions associated with various disorders. The increased prevalence of PTSD found in modern-day hunter-gatherer societies, as compared with industrialized societies, supports the idea that anxiety disorders such as PTSD may be more adaptive in non-industrialized societies that require more survival-related behavioral mechanisms. Studies on immigration, however, support the idea that anxiety-related behaviors considered as maladaptive disorders are more prevalent in native-born Americans as compared with immigrants to the United States. It is unclear why this may be, but it could be related to different social perceptions of anxiety-related symptoms and, therefore, differences in what constitutes an anxiety disorder. Similarly, anxiety behaviors are reinforced and treated in different ways across cultures and between genders. Finally, studies show that biological predisposition to developing specific categories of anxiety disorders seems to be universal. However, prevalence and exact symptomatology of anxiety disorders varies considerably across cultures, ethnicities, and individuals. Anxiety isn't just for students of Psych 323. It's a universal experience that's been preserved throughout the evolutionary continuum and varies according to an individual's environment. While it may often be burdensome, we have to remember that anxiety exists as an evolutionary adaptation, and the key to optimizing it today is remembering its important role within natural selection and the environment.
Here's a little song I wrote. You might want to sing it note